everybody, and welcome to episode 16 of Aimless Ramblings. Today, we're going to tackle a topic which is close to my heart, being boredom. And first of all, I'm going to throw to Simon, who's going to talk a little bit about the psychology of boredom.
So, hi everybody, I'm going to be discussing boredom. So I sort of went, what is the most recent research in this area? And a lot of them are looking at how boredom, which has usually been seen as this catalyst for good creativity, it's like inspiration comes from boredom. It can also have negative effects. So for example, the two that they bring up are substance use and self-harm. And it's really interesting to discuss how boredom isn't just like some concept oh wow, somebody needs to do this so they're bored. But boredom is actually seen as like a need because it's sort of in this. So the part of the brain that registers boredom or you feeling bored is the same one that registers like when you need to go to the toilet, when you're hungry, and it's those inner measures that are supposed to keep you alive. Another thing they also bring up is that, whether interactions are meaningful. So I would like to discuss with you two specifically, what is your experience with boredom as a basic human need? Do you feel like it's basic human need, or do you think that so Sam, you had something you want to say?
I think it's a VB ad. Matter of fact, I've got it now. Sorry, bad joke, but hey.
Yes, you're not wrong. Also, I think earlier on, Sam was discussing the specifics of pain in relation to plants, I think, like a couple of episodes ago. I don't know the exact number, but it'd be interesting if anybody wants to go back to that. Because it also mentions how it's similarly mapped to how we imagine pain. It's not really about not being pleasant. It's about it being a critical alert. So pain says, move your hand away. Where boredom's this critical alert saying, hey, if you keep on this thing, you need to actually do something to actually get out of this funk, or, something negative is going to happen to your psyche or to you physically. As we mentioned before, self-harm and whatnot. But Tim, you have something to say?
Yeah, I suppose it's just a question for the two of you, actually. So I've always thought of boredom as kind of probably coming out of some evolutionary driver to force us to continue to strive to improve our position in the same way, normalcy is creeping. If you become bored of the current circumstance, that drives you to go do things that are more likely to increase your survival, like go out and do more hunting, go out and do more gathering, make preparations for the winter, etc. So from an evolutionary standpoint, that's where I thought maybe boredom comes from. And I'll throw it at Sam in a second because he's got his hand up. But I suppose, and this is something Simon can probably answer, I know that in animals, probably in humans as well, that when someone becomes excessively bored for a long period of time or is cooped up for a long period of time, yes, you talked about depression and self-harm. Do you think that's just because of chronic boredom? And so boredom isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just that it's like pain, like chronic pain can drive someone to want to kill themselves as well. But in the short term, like pain, like a sharp pain from putting your hand on a stove can actually be a pretty beneficial thing in terms of preserving you. So I'll throw it to Sam first because he had his hand up first.
Yeah, interestingly, I think there's probably a lot of evolutionary drivers that would promote inactivity. So a lethargy after eating a large meal is often considered a survival factor. So you're driven to do nothing because you don't require nutrients currently. And when we do stuff is when we die. The same as where they think sleeping may have come from. Obviously, this is all postulated stuff because it's I don't know the right term, but essentially it's not hard science as such. It's closer to a I'm not going to say it because I'm mean. It's not hard science as such, this, but they think, I was going to say it. They think sleeping possibly has come around as a way to essentially just stop us doing stuff for an extended period of time, because when we do stuff is when we die. If we find somewhere to sleep that is safe, we're up a tree, we sleep, we're okay. and it's when we start doing stuff, that we're likely to get eaten by that tiger. So boredom could be a very, I guess, destructive thing, but at the same time, it could be, those that experienced boredom, whilst more likely to die, were more likely to have far more offspring. So who knows? But I'm not sure boredom in and of itself is a positive evolutionary trait.
I was just going to say maybe boredom and lethargy kind of come out of a stasis, in the sense of, like, if you have a individual who is entirely orientated towards lethargy, that's like chronic fatigue almost. That's not good necessarily for its survival. Whereas also, once again, if you've got a creature which is orientated towards constant activity and constantly wanting to do stuff, as you said, 100%. A great example of our bodies being orientated to not doing things is illness and sickness as a symptom of disease in the body, to preserve the body and prevent it from, running around and stopping the immune system from doing what it needs to do. So maybe the phenotype,
maybe.
Yeah, exactly. It's just kind of humanity and animals more broadly support a broad range of different expressions of genetics. So maybe some of us are a little more prone to boredom. Some of us are more prone to lethargy. Simon?
So what I'm actually sort of going to take away from this is a lot of experimentation in animals. Experimentation not meaning that we stab them a lot, meaning that we look at them a lot. Boredom usually comes in social animals, and I feel like boredom comes from not having our social needs met. And from that, I've got a question for you both. Do you think that drained feeling that people who are introverted, so need a lot of internal stimuli, actually is the same kind of indicator as what extroverts and everybody on that spectrum experience when they don't have social interaction and experiencing that boredom? What do you guys think about
that? Really interesting, yeah, because reasonably extroverted person, and if I don't get enough, I guess, like you said, I'm going to call it stimulation, from social interaction, I get almost fidgety almost. And not so much drained, though. Whereas I imagine an introvert being forced to have social interaction may feel drained because they're using a reserve they don't have a lot of, whereas I'm not using a reserve I have a lot of. Does that make sense? What do you reckon, Simon?
Yeah, I definitely agree that there's that reserve. Obviously it can be deficit in one area or another, but introverts seem to almost get their power from a different source. So it's more like, sun versus, meat kind of debate. But yes, I definitely see what you mean by that an introvert might not have that thing. But it was more mainly the source of that. Do you think it's the same as boredom, or do you think it's like a different sort of like survival technique, like an anxiety? But anyway, Tim, you had something you want to say?
Yeah, I was going to say, Simon, that maybe introversion and extroversion. I don't necessarily think introversion and a tendency away from boredom is necessarily a straight linear line. Because I think, once again, extroversion, introversion might exist as social expressions of personality that are beneficial from an evolutionary standpoint. If you have a broad spectrum of introversion, extroversion, certain roles in a social grouping are better suited to those that are extroverted as opposed to those that are introverted. And so, a good collection and correlation of those types probably or possibly provided an evolutionary advantage. Or, we just were able to put up with it and haven't had any significant or at least detrimental impacts upon our survival as a species. Whereas I would say boredom and lethargy maybe, I think, are more primal in terms of, I think you might be able to correct me on this. You were saying that it's generally social animals that experience boredom, so that it would be interesting to see if it is purely linked to social aspects, because for me boredom comes out of also like non-creative pursuits. So like for me, doing repetitive things can make me bored, but it has very little to do with regards to the social circumstance. So if I'm doing the same thing over and over again, even if I'm in the presence of a bunch of other people, I can still become quite bored and want to do something else. So for me, I always thought that maybe boredom would be more along the lines of trying to drive us to try new and novel things, and therefore potentially expanding our social or environmental repertoire. Well, anyway, thanks for that, Simon. That's actually a really interesting topic. But I think Sam actually wanted to talk a little bit about some boredom as well.
No, I'm bored of it now. I was just going to, talk a little bit about boredom and nihilism. So, tried to and failed reading the Pale King by David Foster Wallace. Strange man. And essentially, the part I got through of the book is like incredibly mundane. It's just like snippets of, think of like the most boring part of your day-to-day life. And then someone, putting this into a book. Like I think there was part about, I think it was Illinois's tax code in a novel. And I guess the central concept is essentially how life in and of itself is comprised of essentially the vast majority of the activities we do are boring. Like the likelihood that anyone has a job that they find incredibly entertaining and stimulating constantly is very small. There's always repeat humdrum in a lot of life, like cleaning. I have to clean the house, it's boring. And I guess the issues that people can arrive at where the boredom swamps, I think someone talked about earlier with boredom resulting in self-harm or suicide, where the lack of this stimulation seems to just drain the color from the rest of life. And like a lot of David Foster Wallace's books deal with suicidal ideation, which is not a surprise considering how he is no longer with us. Yeah, thoughts, guys? Simon?
Yeah. You definitely touched on some really good points about how a lot of people don't get their lack of boredom from their workplace. I feel like a lot of, as you were discussing, suicidal ideation and all of that is sort of a snowballing effect, which comes from you not doing I'm going to sound like the hippie trippy psychology student I am, but self-care was this whole entire movement that happened throughout the whole entire time I was there, where you had to take time to fulfill your basic needs, and be that, food, but also I feel like people need to have that need to, break boredom. And that really comes from this movement towards, do what you love within a small step. So that could be, if you really like writing, write for an hour a day. And then the rest of the day, the rest of the day, you do your hard work. But it's just having that time set aside to have self-care is the most important part. And I feel like, as you were discussing, that, suicidal ideation is that like loss of agency. Tim, you had something you want to say?
Yeah, I suppose touching on nihilism is interesting from a boredom perspective, and also I suppose part of the postmodern condition, although you could definitely argue boredom has been with us as long as we have been social animals, as Simon has probably suggested. I think part of the issue of boredom and work does come in part from, if we want to go into the Marxist critique, alienation, in the sense that the work that we do is so abstracted from the fundamental creation of substance or of a particular object, or seeing something through from creation through to the end process of distribution. And from my personal experience as a manager, the soldiers and people that I've worked with who have been most disillusioned, and the ones who are most mentally fragile in terms of have had issues of mental health, etc., have been those who have felt like their job and their life is kind of meaningless and is not attached with the creation or production of something that is beneficial to society, or that they're so far abstracted from those benefits that they can't see tangibly how what they do creates that output. So I think Sam had his hand up first, so I've clearly generated some controversy, but I'll throw it to you first, Sam.
I think controversy is probably the wrong term, but like I think one, like what you've touched on, I think is definitely resonates. I don't know personally, like when I have found life is such incredibly unrewarding, it is because I feel as though I'm having no impact or no production, like I'm not creating as such, which I think goes back to one of our much earlier topics about the desire to create. But knowing a decent number of factory workers, so people whose direct job is the creation of tangible goods, they do not find work stimulating. And I think there has to be something more than just the creation of tangible goods for a workplace to be rewarding, because, they're not unintellectual people, even your sub-average individual is still actually, one of the smartest animals on the planet. You take the dumbest human, they're probably still top tier intelligence in terms of an animal. And so I think we need more than just the creation. We need some form of stimulation. What do you reckon, Simon?
As always, it reminds me of one of the multiple learning things I had. And as you were talking about how the production of a physical object probably doesn't fill that void, as you were discussing with the factory workers. But it reminded me of we were doing development through the lifespan and talking about how elderly people, because a lot of elderly people will fall into a pit of depression because they feel like they're useless. And what happens is that there's a multi-tiered thing, but there's only three I'm going to really focus on. One is that they feel like they are worth something, so they personally have done something. They feel like they are worth something to the society, and they feel like they're worth something to their family. And we're going to focus on the society element. And what they found is that elderly people want to be productive members of society, even if that means that they, read books to read books to youths or something. They want to be part of something. I feel like that comes from boredom. Like the boredom sort of element comes in when it relates to you're not creating something tangible, but it feels like you are giving back. And that giving back element, I feel like, is what gives people a feeling of agency in their work, because they feel like they have a direct impact on something else or someone else. Sam, you have something in response?
Yeah, it resonates incredibly well with me. Like, I think you probably are touching on something real there, Simon. That it's, as you said, the perceivable contribution, which kind of ties in with Tim's soldiers. They are contributing, but the manner in which they contribute or participate in society is abstract enough that it's difficult to perceive. And I mean, the military is an organization that asks an awful lot of its participants. So, yeah. Tim?
So maybe I'm linking back to what Simon said earlier when talking about boredom and extroversion, introversion, and society. Maybe I've got on a wrong track back there, because from what you're saying there, Simon and Sam, maybe boredom is kind of like the centripetal pull that forces social animals together and drives us to actually want to bond as a society. So if we're talking about boredom and a lack of social worth, and boredom and a lack of value in one's life path, life ways, whatever you want to call it, maybe boredom is really the glue that holds us together as social animals within a society. Would you agree, disagree with that, Sam?
Yeah, actually, that's a pretty good point, Tim, because I couldn't really see, as you mentioned earlier, like the evolutionary driver for boredom, because it's just, stimulating you to take actions, which broadly speaking, any additional action is risky. But it could be one of those things where for the individual, it possibly decreases their fitness, but for a society, it massively increases its fitness. So the society, and dogs get bored. Dogs get bored and rip the shit out of your couch, don't they, Max? So all social animals, I guess, experience boredom, and it could be that boredom forces social interaction. Well, not forces, but you understand, is a stimulator for social interaction, which ties back in with Simon's comment that the elderly feel as though that's something lacking in their life, is they don't feel like they're part of our social unit, which in this case is our nation state or our broader community. Yeah, really good points. Interesting. Did you have a topic of your own, Tim?
I did. I was actually going to talk about boredom and creativity, but I think we've almost touched on a bunch of the points there. So I'll put out a brief point, and then we'll invite you guys for some questions and discussion. So this is more anecdotal. So for me, at times when I have felt most dissatisfied with my job, the thing, like one of the big things that really, and I think I've already talked about this in a previous episode, which really pushed me down the path of making the videos, of doing the blogging, making these podcasts, etc., was that I felt like I wasn't creating something, as in I wasn't. I was just doing work, and that work was churning. And yeah, sure, I was having results in terms of the system. It was influencing and creating things, but I felt like there was nothing that I had left my mark on and created with my own hands. And that's why I suppose when I was talking before about alienation and creation, like for me, if there is no individuation in the creation that you're involved in, I don't think it is nearly as therapeutic as, for instance, if you were involved as one of these factory workers and you're saying like putting together a car or something, or building even ventilators, nowadays talking about the retooling of different factories, etc. If you don't feel like your individual personality is coming out or is being involved in the creative process, then I think that the boredom is itself not alleviated. And so for me, one of the things that by making this channel and by making these products has been that it has really been a therapeutic role in terms of alleviating my boredom and alleviating those issues of not feeling like I am creating or contributing, even if it's not really like, couple dozen people listen to these things. Anyway, Simon?
As you were discussing, you were saying that like the creation is sort of you having an outlet, but I feel like in a tiny way you're trying to build a little community because you are like, okay, this is something I'm interested in. And a lot of Reddit streams, a lot of Facebook groups and whatnot is just a bunch of people who are like, I have a similar enough interest that we can make a little community. And it's all about making these little communities within like a new station where we can't actually directly interact. So, well, as you've seen, there's a lot of weird and wonderful communities being created during this time because people can't physically meet anywhere. So a lot of people who've been able to disassociate from like, going to their book club or whatnot have had to find new avenues. And I feel like your creation of these videos is a way to create a very tiny and maybe not a very, talkative community, but you create a community in and of itself. Sam, you had anything you want to say?
It's really interesting, Tim. You're touching on the boredom stimulating creation, but there seems to be a large subset of the community that is all in all reasonably happy to go home and, sit on the couch and watch reality television. They're more than happy not to create. So it could be, there are those that consumption is enough to fill that, I'm going to call it a void, to fill the void, like if you go to an art gallery and you look at art other people have created, or you go to a play, or you consume television, because television is still art, like it gets chat on, but even fucking Big Brother is art. And so, they're willing to just to consume this art, and it could be that they feel their boredom vicariously through the consumption of those, that the consumption of art isn't enough. Oh, two hands. That's how I know I've said something controversial. Who's, the desire to create isn't as strong as just the desire to consume. And that's good enough. Because, I know a lot of people that have quite happy lives and they don't create art or anything like that in a meaningful form. Simon?
I'm going to create a new thing that hopefully some academics, steal. I feel like this is sort of the water cooler community. It's you create a community by simply everybody knows that, Big Brother, people that love Big Brother, they can talk to people who love Big Brother and have that lovely little interaction that, everybody knows Big Brother. So we can all have a basis to start. It's the same with this new meme compilation because that is a stepping block to create a relationship with somebody you have nothing in common with because you both appreciate a single idea and concept. That is the meme culture and meme community. Anyway, Sam?
Holy shit, yeah. that makes total sense. Like Friends, when Friends was a big thing, everyone would go to work the next day and talk about Friends. Really interesting observation. Tim?
So I was going to say, for this idea that you're talking about, how some people are quite happy to consume and how some people are quite happy to create. I mean, a great example of that, I suppose, nowadays is video game streaming, where we have people who are playing a game which is somebody else's art, although it's participative art, so they're involved in the process. And then there's people who are watching somebody else in that participative art process. You can almost call it performance art in some ways. But I think that maybe potentially when we're talking about that different sort of expression of, social archetypes or whatever we want to call them previously, maybe, you're right, Sam. Like there is a certain portion of the population for whom they are quite happy to be the not necessarily passive, because even by their choices they're actively shaping the social landscape, but they are quite happy to be the recipients of art and therefore the judges in some regards. Whereas for other people, that expression comes out in a more creative context. So I mean, no one is going to be one exact polar end of this false binary. Everyone exists somewhere on that spectrum, but you could argue in some regards that the actual people who are creating them themselves, that it's not like some sort of idea, because I know like existentialist philosophers, a lot of them talk about this idea of inauthenticity. So they're saying like if you're not actively creating, then you're living an inauthentic life. So maybe that's the wrong way to think about it. Maybe because a lot of people who are either existentialist philosophers or adherents/disciples of existential philosophy are really just kinds of people who tend to one side of that spectrum of being like, I need to really create, otherwise I don't feel authentic. Whereas for a lot of people, a feeling of authenticity can come from their choices in what they consume. Sam, you had your hand up first?
Yeah. Just made me think of, like, again, going back to consumption of television. One of the more popular TV shows that around the lunch table is incredible. And like, I work with intelligent people. They're all scientists, so it's not like I work with idiots. They're intelligent people, but they love Gogglebox because it is watching people watch television. And it's like you were saying with the video game streaming, it's almost a secondary performance art. So yeah, and another point before I just quickly jump to Simon is it could be like you were saying earlier that there are societal roles that are selected for in a society because it benefits the whole society. If a portion of your society gets itchy feet as such, unless they are creating, and a section of your society are satiated by consumption, you'll have a stable society. Whereas, if you're only the creators, then no one is consuming, and then the creator doesn't have the validation. People love the metaphor of screaming into the void as such, but I guarantee you authors would not write nearly as much as they write if no one read it. A TV show would not exist if no one watched it, So creation requires consumption, and consumption requires creation, so it kind of balances itself. Simon?
I, have to put something completely left field in the back here. But the best example of people who attempt to scream into the void would be these like cult films, which deliberately alienate large sections of the society. But I feel like in a way they're just creating their own little community. So I'm just going to always just bring it back to the community. And as you discuss, maybe people don't want to hear about, the Vaders and how they're not Darth Vader. They're actually some people, like Tim discusses. But there's still people who are very interested in the Vaders. And they're like, wow, somebody actually mentioned this thing that's, I have an interest in. But anyway, Tim, how do you feel about the interesting philosophy that you explore?
Well, I think the best way to sum up both this episode and also my thoughts on the matter more broadly is to steal someone else's quote, which I don't even remember who it's from, so terrible from me, but it goes something like this. Every person who has written a book talking about how they don't care about the opinions of the masses has done so with the express purpose of having their book read, and every person who reads that book and feels superior from it has done so because they want other people to realize that they are superior. So, anyway, gentlemen, thank you very much. A surprisingly interesting topic, noting the topic itself is boredom. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening in, and I hope you tune in next time.
This great warrior has left to his mighty Lord.